Thanks, Dave. I would like to take the opportunity for first of all, a thank you for all of you coming out on an afternoon. I always maintain that George Washington could come back from the dead and give a speech on Valley Forge, and if it's at 3 in the afternoon, no one would show up. So I think this is pretty nice. But even more so, some of my own students are here, and that's much appreciated, and certainly many of my old colleagues are here. And the lifelong learning idea, I think that's maybe why most of us got into university teaching in the first place, because it was a process of lifelong learning. And it's something that we're able to continue to do, and it's much appreciated, the help the deans and others have given us here. So this particular topic is near and dear to my heart, because it has allowed me to combine not only the sociological aspects, but certainly the historical aspects. I was a history major at the undergraduate level, with my lifelong love of sports. I think I got some of this because my father was a baseball and a fast-pitch softball player of some repute, and I have his old scrapbooks of which he played years and years and years against what were known as the old Negro teams, the Negro League teams. And so it was a part of my life in hearing him tell his stories about many of these things. It all came together then in this particular presentation, which I keep adding to. It's for those of you who have taught, you remember you add to classes and you keep forgetting to take things out, right? And so this presentation, you know, I have to give it the squash here, otherwise we'll be here way too late, but we'll do the best that we can. This quote here is something that I found not long ago that I thought was rather interesting. And you can, where the they are and the theys are would actually identify the group of people that this was talking about. And for our purposes, obviously, with the topic of today, you can read that, hopefully you can in the back there, and you come to the conclusion, well, this must have applied towards African Americans or blacks or something, out of Harpers Weekly magazine, one of the most popular magazines of its era in 1851. But there's one small problem with this understanding that we have. This was written about the Irish, okay? So where the they are is you just put Irish. And the reason that I've included this is, for us today, it's very, very difficult for us to understand what life was like in the 1800s, and certainly the way that they looked at people of different ethnic backgrounds or different races. This was perfectly logical. Of course the Irish were like this. But if you talk to other groups, they would pick another group. It didn't really matter. And the reason I'm bringing it as part of this presentation is, as we move forward, I'm going to kind of trace from about the Civil War time period all the way to the more modern era. We kind of have this notion, you know, that sports kind of changed on its own, and certainly why didn't those people realize how wrong it was to exclude African Americans from playing and all of that? My argument is a little bit different, and that is these kinds of ideas were normative. These were pretty typical in our country through the 1800s on into the 1900s. This is not an unusual sort of a thing at all. And so I've kind of altered my views a little bit on some of this and how baseball ultimately does move forward. Is that Obama? Is Obama calling you again? Golly!
I don't know who it is.
Oh, okay. Wait till the president hears that you refused that call. Nonetheless. We, by the way, have Jackie Robinson's nephew here. Jack, would you stand up, Wendell? There it is. You see the shirt? And there's Robinson. Thank you very much, Wendell. We're going to start with this. Besides the fact that Ruth and Gehrig are always kind of interesting, the real purpose of this is to take a look at this particular magazine, or it was more like a newspaper called the Sporting News. It still exists, but it's online. We've lost this. But as a kid, if we could just get our hands on a Sporting News. I think they were a quarter, if I'm not mistaken. And they had all the baseball statistics in it, all of what we would now call box scores, and you could catch up on a whole week's worth every single time. And this literally was the Bible of baseball for many, many years. Now, what's interesting about this, also, in 1939, they had an article written about baseball, and I've got a couple of things if you'll bear with me here. The crux of the article was this. It says within the article, baseball, the national game, the nation's greatest force for democracy, the melting pot of the sons of all languages, the cauldron of equal opportunity. And it went on and listed all of the baseball players with foreign-sounding names. The DiMaggios were there. Lavagetto was there. Hank Greenberg was thrown in because he was a great Jewish player. Close enough. But the article was writing about this incredible force for democracy and the melting pot, which is a curious sort of a thing for baseball's Bible to talk about when you realize 10% of the population, including significant numbers of highly skilled baseball players, were excluded from this great melting pot. And, you know, to me, it's an interesting sort of a reaction to the process, because the two most famous, most popular, and wage-earning, I might add, the two richest players in terms of salary were these two guys. Babe Ruth, of course, on the right, and Satchel Paige on the left. So your Bible's talking about, it gives you some small idea of how a lot of the folks in power in the 1930s looked at the role of baseball in this country. Now, some of you remember who Joe Garagiola is. He's still alive, but he was a catcher for many, many years, and more a broadcaster for many years. And then he became like a game show host for many years. He had a lot of roles, but he told a remarkable story. And it talks to you a little bit about ethnicity in this country, because people were identified by the ethnic makeup that they came from. 1946, Garagiola, a good Italian lad, is catching. The umpire, Augie Donatelli's behind him. And Garagiola does not like the calls. And they're arguing. And in frustration, Garagiola says, Augie, look. Paulette, Howie Paulette, on the mound. He's a frog, Frenchman. Musial at second's a Polak. Shane Deach, he's a Dutchman. Marion, he's a Mick, Irish. Third base, Karowski. There's two Italians in the whole park, and you want to throw one of us out of the game. The point of that is, guys they were identified by their ethnicity. And these guys, certainly the man on the left, was unfortunately excluded from that process. Now, this is a fellow that you probably have never heard of. I was reading some stuff on the Civil War, and baseball, of course, spreads. Baseball is brought, or versions of baseball, were in the prisoner of war camps. And when the war ended, everybody went home, and they took the versions of the game with it. And that was a major factor behind the stress of it from the American Civil War, or as my good friend Dave Lindsay says, the War of Northern Aggression. He was raised in Texas. Nonetheless, you have that. Octavius Cattle was this guy's name. He was of mixed heritage, born as a free person in South Carolina. And Cattle was taken as a young boy moved to Philadelphia. His father was a minister. Cattle was absolutely brilliant. #1 student at the Institute for Colored Youth, established by the Quakers in Pennsylvania. It's now Cheyney University. If you're familiar with Cheyney University, that started as the Institute for Colored Youth put on by the Quakers. This man was a student, became valedictorian, ended up teaching Greek, teaching math, teaching all the sciences. This guy was something else in Philadelphia. Now, during the Civil War time period, Cattle took on a role which, again, we don't think about these things today. He was Martin Luther King 100 years early. Because what Cattle did was looked at the situation of African Americans in Philadelphia, and he said, we got to do something about this. He was a civil rights guy before anybody knew the words. So blacks were not allowed on the trolley cars in Philadelphia. He led the charge against that. He led the charge against housing segregation. He led the charge about voting because blacks had been excluded even in Pennsylvania from voting in 1838. And so Cattle came along and he like, you know, some people are like born leaders or whatever you want to say. That was this guy. And so he rose through the ranks in Philadelphia. Everybody knew who he was. He was involved in all sorts of things. And it was at that point he starts a colored baseball team. He actually played cricket, and then he got into baseball. But he organized it all. The major cities had the white teams. The major cities developed black teams. And Cattle was the guy who was responsible for this. Cattle argued this is where black folks can meet and talk and share ideas and all of those things. Now, shortly after the war, among other things, I should tell you this, during the war too, to give you an idea how this guy was. He raised 11 regiments of black soldiers for the Union Army. And he was a major. They made him a major. I mean, this guy's something else. He was involved in politics as well. But for our purposes here, he decided, why can't black teams join the new Association of Baseball Clubs, the first one that had been created a few years before? The other, his big opponent, the Philadelphia Athletics, as in Philadelphia A's, Kansas City A's, Oakland A's, backed him and said, these guys should be allowed in our association too. Cattle got his response in less than a week. And that was, not only will we not accept colored teams, we will not accept any team that has a colored player. And to my knowledge, there may be others, but it's the first time I ever saw an official declaration of exclusion. This is right after the Civil War. And by the way, before I leave Octavius Cattle, he was involved in politics. He was, of course, Republican, as the party of Lincoln. He was constantly doing battle with the Irish who controlled the political processes of South Philadelphia. Cattle was walking down the street in front of his house. A man named Frank Kelly's coming from the other direction. They admit words were exchanged. Cattle kept walking. Kelly turned around and shot Cattle 3 times in the back, and he literally died on the steps, his own front steps. And the funeral that was held, so many people came. It was the largest funeral in the history of Philadelphia, with the exception of when Lincoln's body was brought through after he was assassinated. Now that's an interesting guy of Octavius Cattle. But for our purposes here, he started baseball. He tried to go through the regular channels, and as skilled an individual as he was, well, other forces intervened. After the Civil War, baseball has spread. It's going around the country. The big cities, particularly the northeastern cities, all had baseball teams. This fellow is the first. Most people will accept the fact that as these teams expanded in all different levels, this fellow's generally considered, as you see here, the first Negro player to perform in the majors. Now, part of that problem is you don't even know what the majors really is at that time, but the major teams, you could say. And this fellow, Moses Fleetwood Walker, Fleet they called him, Fleet Walker, he and his brother, he was a catcher. This was no ordinary man either, because Fleet Walker's father was a physician. He graduated from Oberlin College, and then he went to the University of Michigan Law School. Again, nobody was doing that in those days. I mean, if someone had a high school diploma, that was really something. This guy went in that direction of an academic side and a great ball player. And so everybody knew him. They knew him. He was a very, very bright guy. He went on, by the way, wrote 3 books. One of them in 1908 was a treatise on why African Americans needed to go back to Africa, because he said there's nothing for us here, which is kind of an interesting treatise for a man like this. But now, this guy, Moses Walker, intersects with this guy, Cap Anson, Adrian Cap Anson. In the latter 1800s, arguably the greatest baseball player of that particular era, one of the first to go into the Hall of Fame. He was a big man for that age, that being 6 foot and 200 pounds. Remember, the average soldier in the Civil War was 5'6". So this guy was 6 foot, powerfully built guy. the first white baby born in Marshalltown, Iowa. What becomes Marshalltown, next to the Pocahontas Indian Reservation. And so this guy grew up. No one knows later in life why he hated blacks the way that he did. I've never found anything that could account for it. The stories of what the things he would do are legendary. We don't have time, but believe me, this guy went out of his way to make life miserable for African Americans in this country, or black Americans of his time period. Now, where these two intersect, Moses Fleet Walker and Adrian, or Cap, Anson, was baseball in the latter 1800s consisted of people traveling around. They had leagues, kind of. They didn't always meet, didn't play all the games, but they would put on exhibitions. And so the end result was this guy, the greatest star of his era, if Cap Anson is coming, we're going to pay to see him. And so they set up an exhibition game with Cap Anson, and Cap Anson discovered that Fleet Walker was going to catch. And Cap Anson said, if he plays, I'm not. Now, the guys that put this on were caught because the people were paying to see Cap Anson. And they buckled under and would not let Fleet play. He was done. Cap Anson played. Everybody got their money. And right after that, it was called the Gentleman's Agreement. The major teams got together and said, this is 1892 or something like that, and said, okay, no more colored players will ever appear with white players. And that gentleman's agreement went into effect for the minor leagues, smaller teams. It was immediately adopted by all of them. And so these two intersected in a way which now blacks were excluded. Nobody knows for sure how many black players actually were at the major league level back then. Nobody knows. Some think up to 50. 9 have been documented that I know of, but there probably were more. And it came about because of the actions of Cap Anson. And again, he made it to the Hall of Fame and all of that, but there's another side to him. Now, as we move on through the early 1900s, again, it is very difficult for us today. Now, there are a number of historians here in the room who know full well all about these things, but far better than I do. But this country dealt with racial issues from the 1900s to the 1920s and 30s that most of us would have a hard time believing actually happened. And this is the case. I put this particular slide in here because one of the factors, which was a significant one for the time period, was when over 400,000 African American soldiers came back from France after having fought in World War I. And these guys came home. Here they are marching, you know, how they used to do in Washington and that. And they found that the conditions here back home weren't any better than when they left. And so they started raising lots more questions about what was going on. And this is a fairly, you know, there people were writing about things. Of course, every major city north anyway, had a black newspaper. Even the newspapers were segregated. So the black papers were always writing about these things, and grudgingly the occasional white reporter would talk about it. But this really seemed to have an impact on some folks. As you will see, when the soldiers come back in World War II, there's an even stronger impact. This is an example of a riot, a major one in Chicago in 1919. And you know, I don't know if you guys can read this one. Ghastly deeds of race rioters told. Gun battles and fighting in the streets keep the city in an uproar. This was one of 25 major riots that summer alone in this country. And so what caused the riot? Well, Lake Michigan there, with Chicago, there were white beaches and there were black beaches. And a black boy, a youth, was on a raft on the black water, if you want to say that, and he drifted into the white beach, at which point people start throwing stones at him, and they killed him. And that was the spark 38 people died in this one, and hundreds were hurt, unbelievable amount of damages. This is one of 25. And this is what the country was dealing with at that time. There remained lynchings in certain places. I mean, this was the racism of the time period, that when you look at baseball then and having a white and black league, it kind of becomes fairly insignificant. But it clearly understands why it was so hard to get these things to actually come together. Now, whoops, sorry about that. You may or may not recognize this guy, and I'm putting him in here to kind of berate the point maybe of how racist the system was. This is Henry Ford. And what this says, if fans want to know the trouble with American baseball, they have it in 3 words: too much Jew. Now here you have one of the greatest industrialists of all times with a very open, overt proclamation of what his, and because if you've ever seen his newspapers that he made in Dearborn, Michigan, this was a pretty constant message. The way this came about was, of course, there was a 1919 Black Sox scandal. Chicago White Sox team against Cincinnati Reds. Chicago was heavily favored. The gamblers bet on the Reds, and the White Sox, of course, through the World Series, deliberately lost. And, of course, that's called the Black Sox scandal. Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis was brought in as the first commissioner, I'll get to him in a little bit, to clean this up. Henry Ford said, because the lead gambler that got to the players was a man named Arnold Rothstein. That's all you need to know. The Jews are behind this, according to Henry Ford. Now to show you, and I know I'm going overboard maybe, but I'm kind of fascinated by this aspect. You may or may not know, in Hitler's book on Mein Kampf, there's only one American named by name, Henry Ford. Hitler thought Henry Ford was A-OK. All right? This is a picture of Henry Ford on his 75th birthday, a special medal created by Hitler, the Grand Cross of the Supreme Order of the German Eagle, for Henry Ford. And these are 2 German ambassadors who are giving it to him. Not Hitler, but 2 of his ambassadors. Can you imagine in today's country, if one of our leading industrialists came out and said and did the things that this guy did, and yet he got away with that? I mean, that's to me is the most stunning part of the whole thing. In 1920, this guy came along. You can see a pretty powerfully built fellow named Rube Foster. Rube Foster had been a wonderful baseball player in his own right. He'd been raised in Texas, dropped out of school in the 8th grade, not that unusual. Had an interesting personal history. No alcohol for him. He did, however, smoke a pipe. And when he gave, you know what signals are in baseball, right? He would sit in the dugout. 2 puffs meant like steal second. 1 puff meant bunt. You know, that's how he gave by doing that. And he always carried a gun with him. I don't know. Interesting fellow. Rube calls a meeting. The YMCA building in Kansas City. It still exists. It's right down the street from the Negro Baseball Museum. It's still there. He called the meeting of these various owners of these black teams. He said, let's create our own league. And so that became eventually the Negro National League. And Rube Foster was the guy that put it together. Rube was a very shrewd fellow. He said, I'll do all of this, and you don't even have to pay me. Really? And then he slipped in, but I would take 5% of all the gate receipts. He got 5% of all the gate receipts. Rube knew what he was doing. A little later in life, and not much later in life, in the 1926, 27 era, right in there, Rube came under some real serious sorts of issues. The heck is that? Turn those things off, will you? Better yet, throw them in the trash can, whatever you have to do. So Rube had organized the league, and they were in certain cities. In 1930 came the Eastern League, which was the other version of it that evolves in 1930. But what you had was Rube Foster came along, gets it going, and he had some real serious personal difficulties. He kind of like went crazy almost. He was diagnosed, well, his family had him committed to an asylum in Kankakee, Illinois, as a paranoid schizophrenic. They found out later that he had been staying, I think it was in Gary, Indiana, staying in a hotel room, and there was a gas leak, and he breathed this stuff in, and he was never the same. Heaven only knows what he was breathing in. And they think that might have been part of it. He spent 3 years wandering around saying, I'm getting ready to pitch in the World Series, which was pretty remarkable because there were no blacks playing in the white leagues. I mean, he was way out. By 1932, he was dead. He was only 53 years old. And then again, not to dwell on funerals, so many people came, it took 3 days for all of them to pass by his coffin. That's how popular Rube Foster actually was. And so the Negro Leagues begin. They flourish in the 20s. There was a lot of money in the 20s. Things were going pretty well in this country. And then, of course, ultimately, things happen with the Depression. And it certainly impacts what happens with the development of baseball in this country. One of the Negro League's most popular teams were the Pittsburgh Crawfords. Crawfords, the owner owned the Crawford Grill. It was an eating place in Pittsburgh, and consequently that's where the name came from. But their owner even built their own stadium in Pittsburgh. This is one of the most famous teams of all time. If you're a baseball historian at all, you might recognize a few of these folks. The one on the far right is Oscar Charleston, Hall of Fame player. Next to him, let's see, we've got Satchel Paige. And we've also got in the middle here, Cool Papa Bell. He's 9 over from the left. And Josh Gibson, the Black Babe Ruth, here. The fourth one is Wendell Brandis. Perhaps not. I got that wrong, Wendell, but nonetheless. What you've got is these guys, an example of one of the greatest teams of all among the black leagues. And these teams, the players kind of went to whoever would pay them the most. But this one was a collection of among the finest. Now, the Depression hits. The white leagues are suffering because people don't have any money. The black teams are really suffering, same reason. The white owners were not interested in getting the black teams to join them because they were charging the black teams to rent their baseball facilities. So the white owners were quite happy to keep having the black teams because they helped pay the rent. So there were a lot of undercurrents in this kind of stuff that were going on. Some of the teams took it upon themselves, what's called barnstorming. You would travel around all little towns who never saw major league games, and they would put on exhibitions. Usually, quite often, the white local team would play a variety of these black teams that were circling. This one was called the Ethiopian Clowns. These guys would come on and do all sorts of routines, crazy things. They all adopted Ethiopian names. Like one of this guy's name was Selassie, for example. But people would pay. They would come to see these guys. And this wasn't the only one. I mean, my dad's scrapbooks are full of this stuff. And the Zulu Cannibal Kings, they came out in grass skirts and bones in their noses and all of that. Very demeaning by today's standards. These guys argued it paid the rent. See, they knew what they were doing, but it didn't matter. They had to make money, and these guys did this. Now, these guys became the Indianapolis Clowns, and the Indianapolis Clowns eventually became the very last of the black teams to survive. They were around until about 1970. When I was a college student playing baseball in my hometown of Davenport, Iowa, they brought in the Clowns to play us. Now, I'm a dumb college kid, right? I wasn't, looking back, I sure didn't appreciate what I was about to experience. We show up, and they brought all of us in from the Quad Cities, hoping that our girlfriends and our parents and our friends would come to fill the crowd. Here come the Clowns, and I was one naive Iowa kid. I had not seen anything quite like this. And what I had these memories because I was playing third base, and I was watching them, or they got a guy on first, and here's the guy that they got on first. Duro Austin. Okay. They say he's 3'4". He was lower. He was smaller than that. I've never seen anything like it. He led off, of course, and he did this. It was impossible to throw him a strike. What I remember, he got on first base, and I'm looking over. He took his lead, and he looked under the legs of our first baseman at the pitcher. And I had that angle. That's what I can remember. The other thing later on that was pretty amazing, I'll show you another one on Dero. And this is of course, all set up. He got a strike called. Satchel Paige threw a 5-foot pitch, called it a strike. So this is what Dero Austin would do. And then you can see here, he can't control himself, and he takes a bat to the umps and everything else. This sold tickets, okay? What I remember, too, at that game was they took pre-game infield. I'm in the dugout, and I had bad vision anyway, and I'm kind of watching these guys, and they're taking the infield, and they're here and over to first and throwing it home and flipping it like that. There was no ball. It's called shadow ball. And the guy with the bat could make a sound. He could go boom, like a bat hit a ball. Third baseman would like scoop up dust, turn like this. You'd look, first baseman, throw it to the catcher, go like this, and hit a ground ball to short. Of course, Dero Austin literally was on top of the dirt, and he would like that, and I can still see that, and I didn't even realize there wasn't a ball. It was only later that I realized there really wasn't a ball. And strangely enough, no one ever recorded that, like with a video, that routine. Ken Burns, in his baseball thing, talks about it, about the famous shadow ball of the Clowns. The other thing I remember on that game was Birmingham Sam, big, long, lanky first baseman. He came out in the middle of the game, and he placed a lawn chair on the field, and he had a baseball glove this big. And he sat there, and everybody's laughing. I'm batting. I hit left-handed. The pitcher was left-handed. That was not a good combination for me. I thought, wait a minute, this guy's in a lawn chair. I'll bunt. So I just dragged the ball down the first base line. Well, you can't get out of a lawn chair and get anybody out. I'm on first. I think I'm pretty slick, right? My lead was this big. Pitcher snaps the ball over to Sam, and he goes, shh. And have you ever had the wind knocked out of you? And I was just praying, please, please, please don't have a wild pitch or something, because there's no possible way I could have made it to second base. And I'm over there, and it was very much, I embarrassed him, he embarrassed me. And that's how the game was played. So you had the Clowns, and you had quite a number of those teams which were circulating in that time period. You also had these guys. This is the House of David. House of David is in Benton Harbor, Michigan. There are still remnants of it left. It was a religious commune. It was not Jewish. Some people always thought it was Jewish. It's a religious commune, kind of a crazy character, put it all together. One way of getting his word out was to support these teams. They had 3 of these teams at one time traveling around the United States, playing in any place they could play. And they actually had some pretty good skills. They had, you can see, the hair and the beards and all that stuff was required. My father played for these guys. And to get my dad talking about it was quite interesting, because he could not grow a beard, nor can I, and they glued a beard on him with a wig. And you had to know my dad. He'd have his cigar, and he'd say, hot, you want to talk about hot? Put on a beard, a wig, and wool suits in July. He said, just try playing with that. I can still hear him say that. And these guys traveled the country. There was also a black House of David team. Had nothing to do with these guys, except they stole the name. Why? Because these guys could play. They had, pitchers like Grover Cleveland Alexander, some of these guys got out of the majors, played for these guys. So they stole the House of David name because people would come, because it meant they had a good team. So there is even a black House of David. Now these guys, I did a very small portion of this. My wife works in a nursing home as a speech pathologist, and she said, would you come and just do something for the folks that are there? And I said, yeah. And I thought, my first reaction was, obviously I don't know what I'm talking about, and that was, how are they going to handle all of these things? It was a wonderful audience. About 30 people came. They lived all this segregation stuff, see? They knew what I was talking about. And I got to this point with this group, and I said, now this religious commune, they did not believe in sex. They were celibate. They did not believe in alcohol. and did not believe in tobacco. And so I said to this group, no tobacco, no alcohol, and no sex. And a little old lady in the corner yells out, and no fun either. She goes like that. And after I was done, she was 102, and she had perfect timing. I mean, the whole place just came unglued with her analysis of the house of David. But this is what was going on in the 30s. You had to make a buck somehow. So you had the white leagues, you had the black leagues, and you had these kinds of guys running around doing a variety of things. Now, we're now in the 36-37 time period. Recession or depression is very, very powerful at that time. Jobs, people. You have an unemployment rate of 75% in Detroit in 1932, 69% in Pittsburgh, unemployment of 69% in one city. Can you imagine what this is like? All of these pressures are coming together. You still have black writers who are talking about, how come the black guys can't play in the white leagues? You had those pressures, you had political pressures, you had immigration pressures after World War I and after World War II. You know, right after World War I, they were averaging 16,000 black migrants, I guess, a month from the southern states into the northern cities. 16,000 a month. People who were looking for jobs, looking for housing, challenging the immigrant groups who were there for the limited jobs and housing that were there. This is what you're finding yourself now. Then this guy appears, Jake Powell. Jake was a pretty good major league outfielder. In the 36 series, I think he had led the series for the Yankees in hits and all that stuff. So people knew who he was. So Jake Powell, the next year, they opened the season in Comiskey Park in Chicago. And as they do now, they decide to interview last year's World Series hero, Jake Powell. And they have Jake Powell there, WGN Radio, as in WGN TV today. Bob Elson, famous announcer, is interviewing Jake Powell to start the new season. And he says asks an innocent question. Jake, what'd you do over the winter? Apologize for the language here, but Jake Powell says, well, I went back to Toledo, joined the police force, spent the winter cracking niggers over the head. Live, on the radio, on the biggest radio station in the country. Elsa desperately tries to get this guy off the radio. There is a firestorm, as you can only imagine. Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis's office was in Chicago. His phone, I mean, unbelievable. By the next day, the city officials in Chicago had petitions to ban Jake Powell from baseball forever. Now what are you going to do with him? What are the owners going to do? How do you defend this kind of stuff? So the white owners are caught between all of these pressures, and what are we going to do when you have people like this saying the kinds of things they did? By the way, later in his career, first of all, Judge Landis gave him a 10-day suspension. He was known as the great white father in the black press, Judge Landis was. And they swatted him on the rear. He spent the 10 days going into Harlem. You know who Bojangles Robinson was? Famous dancer, black dancer. He was a big Yankee fan. Bojangles took Jake Powell into the bars in Harlem because the Yankee owners were afraid they might not sell as many tickets now. Pretty amazing stuff. And so Jake Powell pulls this stunt later in Yankee Stadium. Lots of Jewish fans in New York City. And they're in the crowd, and they're razzing him, and they're giving him to it pretty good. And Jake Powell turns to him between innings and does this. Gives a Nazi salute to the Jewish fans in New York City. That's Jake Powell, okay? The Yankees get rid of him, he bounces around. He dies, you can see, relatively young. Jake Powell was known as someone who would steal anything, anywhere he went. His manager said when they stayed in rooms, he said Jake Powell would steal the bed and the drapes if he could figure out a way to do it. Anyway, they got him bouncing bad checks. They took him to a jail in Washington, D.C. Somehow he produces a gun and he kills himself. That was the end of Jake Powell. Obviously a very, very disturbed sort of fellow. But this situation brings all of these forces together. And they're saying, how come? How can this be? How can we continue to have these things happening in this country? So you can see it starts to build up into a pretty significant force. This is Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis. Born in Ohio, raised in Indiana, Kennesaw Mountain is down in Georgia. There was a Civil War battle there, and his father fought in it, and I guess that's where, I don't know how he got the name. This guy, high school dropout, went to night school, got a high school diploma, got a law degree in Union College in Chicago. Teddy Roosevelt appointed him to the federal judgeship in 1905. He was let's say a very, very interesting man. Without question, an avowed racist. His language was deplorable. There aren't many good things you can say. Think of most negative things you could think about someone, and he was pretty much it. Pretty unbelievable sort of a guy, but he was chosen to clean up the Black Sox scandal in 1919. He became a commissioner in 1920, and he ruled with an iron fist. One of the first things he tried to do was he did not want these players like Babe Ruth playing against those black folks in the 20s and 30s. I mean, Landis went overboard. He was quoted as saying publicly, "There'll be no niggers that play in white baseball as long as I'm alive." So if you want to look for roadblocks to desegregation, you can start right there. Because anytime someone even hinted at the idea of trying to do something differently, he would squash them. Bill Veeck, you might remember the name Bill Veeck. Bill Veeck came to him in 1943 and said, he was going to buy the Philadelphia Phillies. And Landis said, "You buy the Phillies, you'll bring in black players." So he banned Veeck from buying the Phillies. This is what Kennesaw Mountain Landis was actually like. And so when this case of Jake Powell landed with Landis, it was 10-day suspension. Nothing's going to happen. The press, of course, goes nuts over this kind of stuff, and Landis didn't budge one bit. And he was one of the great roadblocks of all time with this. Then you got other people stirring up problems as well. It's a great time of trial and tribulation. A. Philip Randolph built the Union of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Remember, most people took trains. And those were staffed largely by black porters and people that worked on the railroad line. He organized them at a time, now we're about to enter World War II, and where this whole country had to mobilize. Everybody had to pull together. So he was fighting against the segregation of industry, the segregation of the military, what would be called today civil rights marches. He was threatening Franklin Roosevelt, "I'll put 100,000 people in the streets tomorrow if you don't do something about some of the racial things in this country." And was called by more than one writer the most dangerous man in America because of the kinds of things that he was saying and the kinds of things he was doing. And so all of this is coming together. The politicians are scrambling. LaGuardia, for example, in New York City, puts a special committee together to look at trying to do something about race and specifically baseball. Why? Well, LaGuardia wanted votes. I mean, that's really the reasoning behind it. And then this guy comes along, Happy Chandler. Fortunately for all, Landis dies in 1944. Now, maybe something can happen. And you ended up with Happy Chandler being appointed. Happy Chandler had been the governor in the state of Kentucky, which generally is considered to be a southern state. He's a bit of a mix on this. At one time, he was going to be George Wallace's running mate in the presidency. At the same time, Chandler went out of his way to deal with 2 segregation cases of schools in Kentucky. So he's kind of all over the place. Of course, the writers came to him and said, "What do you think about blacks playing?" And his argument was, Chandler said, "Well, if black boys can die on Guadalcanal, and black boys can die on Okinawa, Yeah, I think they could play baseball. All of a sudden people start saying, wait a minute, maybe there's a real chance here. Maybe there's a chance to effect some meaningful kind of change. These guys came home, tens of thousands of African American soldiers, 1945 and 46. This is what they faced when they came home. So the pressures start mounting again. How is it possible that these guys can go over and get themselves killed, but you can't even play in the American pastime? And it all starts kind of coming together in one way or another. And then this guy shows up, Branch Rickey. Branch Rickey is the fellow who, of course, finds Jackie Robinson and brings him to the major leagues, but Branch Rickey has a long, long history. He was the guy who developed the Cardinal farm system, first one to do that. That's why the Cardinals won so many pennants in the 30s and 40s, because of Branch Rickey. He went to work with the Dodgers. Rickey's the guy who decided, I'm going to find a black ball player, and I'm going to do it. Landis is dead. Chandler's kind of looking the other way. Now, Rickey couldn't come out and say, I'm going to find some black players. Wouldn't have been possible. In 1945, the 16 baseball owners had voted on blacks. The vote was 15-1 against. So don't get the idea that these the owners suddenly went out and said, we're going to bring in black players. So Rickey says, okay, I'll fool them all. He announced, we're going to create a new team, the Brooklyn Brown Dodgers, a black team to play in the Negro Leagues. People were a little bit suspicious, but he sent his scouts out to find the right kind of player, the right kind of black player. Yeah, you had to have some ability in baseball, but he wanted other kinds of things. He wanted someone that there'd be no question about them on a personal level. Because you see, one of the great arguments that were always pulled out is you can't put blacks on the team because after all, they just wouldn't get along well in the clubhouse. That was done in Octavius Cattle Day in Philadelphia. So you had to be careful with this stuff. This guy then, Rickey, goes out, sends out his scouts. Some of the greatest players, black players, were angry when Robinson was eventually chosen. They wanted him to be successful. But Josh Gibson, Satchel Paige, Gibson had died, but the great older black players weren't chosen first, and they thought they should have been, although Robinson was like 28, I think, by now. Now, Robinson had grown up in California. Why? Because his family, his mother in Georgia in 1920, in their county, in 1 week, there was the black, kind of like an Elks Club thing, had burned down. Social gathering place had burned down. 3 churches had burned down, and a black school burned down in that county. And Mallory Robinson said, we're out of here. Packed up her 5 kids, including Jackie, took them to California. That's where he grew up. So what you had was Rickey finding him. Robinson was, I think, unbelievably underestimated for his athletic ability. This guy, well, no one's ever done what he's done in regard to intercollegiate athletics. The only guy ever to win varsity letters in 4 different sports at UCLA. Led the Pac, well, it becomes the Pac-10, it was Pac-6 or 8 then, in basketball and scoring. Led him in football. They said he was an O.J. Simpson before O.J. Simpson. He was that good. I know he led the nation in returning punts and stuff like that. He was a fabulous track man. Won the national running broad jumps nationally. What you don't hear is he won the national black tennis championships, the national black ping pong championships. Oh yeah, and we haven't got around to baseball yet. Baseball was his 4th best sport. He didn't really care about baseball, didn't do all that well in college. Gets in the Army, is an officer in Texas in 1944, when he creates a stir to the point he is court-martialed. Why? Because Jackie Robinson would not sit in the back of the bus on a military base in Texas. Even though the military bases specifically said you may not segregate the buses, Jackie sat in the middle with a very, very light-skinned black woman. The bus driver saw it, ordered him off the bus. He wouldn't do it. By the time they stopped, they arrested Robinson, and now the military's got a problem. Because you have a guy known across this country as one of the greatest athletes ever, And what are we going to do? And the solution was they gave him a physical. He had injured his ankle playing football at UCLA, and the Army said, this ankle will not allow you to continue as an officer in the United States Army. What did he do? He left, joined the Kansas City Monarchs in the Black League, played 44 games, 42 games, something like that. That's all. And then he was found by Branch Rickey. Rickey brought him to New York, sat him down in a room. Now remember, Robinson is a powerfully built guy. Rickey says this, Jack, I've been looking for a great colored player for a great many years. I have reason to believe you might be the man. I need a man who can take abuse, insults, in other words, carry the flag for the race. Robinson, if some guy slides into you and calls you a black so-and-so, you'd come up swinging, and you'd be justified. But you'd set back this cause for 20 years. For 3 hours, Branch Rickey circled him, screaming insults. This is what they're going to say to you, Robinson, and unloaded on him. And Robinson, they said he sat there like this powerful man, and he's like this. He was so angry he was shaking. And Rickey's going around him and going around him and going around him. And finally Robinson says, Mr. Rickey, do you want a player who's afraid to fight back? And Rickey doesn't miss a beat. He says, I want a player with guts enough not to fight back. You will symbolize a crucial cause, and you cannot fight back. And there's another pause as Robinson is thinking. And he finally says, Mr. Rickey, if you want to take this gamble, I promise you there will be no incident. And that's why, if you followed this at all, if you saw the movie 42, most of it's actually accurate. Some things aren't, but that's why no matter what they did to him, they threw at him. He led the league in getting hit by pitches. They'd slide into second and cut him up and everything else, and he never ever fought back. And there's a very famous scene in there that's more or less portrayed the right way, in which the Philadelphia team is all over him. And it's between innings, and Robinson's standing out there, and Pee Wee Reese from Kentucky, a southern lad, came up to Robinson, between innings now, put his hand on his shoulder. Didn't say anything. And it was okay. We're accepting him. You've got to accept him as well. And it started to turn at least a little bit. Of course, Robinson ends up being a tremendous player, far better than what anybody thought. Many top executives didn't think he'd make it in the major leagues. And yet he was able to eventually, of course, reach the Hall of Fame, which is represented there. Robinson, by the way, to the very end, he was invited, 25th anniversary of him signing to play baseball, and they wanted to bring him to the World Series, and Robinson didn't want to do it. Robinson became very much an active civil rights person and very active in the black communities of trying to do things. He refused to go. Robinson had serious diabetic issues, and finally, they said, we can't have this celebration if you're not there. And Robinson said, then I'll say what I want to say. And they said, well, yeah. So he got up there, and this is on tape. You perhaps have seen it, but Robinson makes this impassioned plea, and so proud that he was able to become, the first African-American or black, he would have said. And he said, but I'll be more proud when I can look in that coaching box, in that man in that dugout, and see black faces there. So to the very end, he continued to push. 2 weeks later, he was dead. 2 weeks later, he was gone. Now, last thing here, I threw this in for the true baseball nut. You never heard of this guy, Eddie Klepp. Eddie Klepp was the white guy who desegregated the black leagues. 1946. He pitched for the Cleveland Buckeyes, and he had the same problems. He was down south in Montgomery, Alabama, and the laws were blacks and whites couldn't play on the same team. He was not allowed to play because it was a black team, and he was a white guy. So I just thought, if you've never heard of Eddie Klepp, that's who that guy is. So in conclusion here, if I can find what I want to say, which maybe I can't, I always have a couple of different endings, but one of them that I thought was pretty interesting. This is in the Negro Baseball Museum in Kansas City. If you haven't had a chance to go there, it's a really, really well done museum. This is written by a white fan from Brooklyn, a Brooklyn Dodger fan, when Jackie Robinson is brought to the major leagues. And this man said this: "Did I feel uncomfortable when black fans descended on Ebbets Field when Jackie Robinson came up?" Remember the famous newspaper line from a nursery rhyme when we were kids, Jack jump over the candlestick thing? The line was, "Jackie's nimbles, Jackie's quick, Jackie made the turnstiles click." See, Jackie Robinson brought in money, and he knew it. Anyway, he said, "Let me put it this way. I felt uncomfortable in the first game and a little awkward in the second game with black fans. By the third game, we were all cheering wildly together and spilling soda all over each other. By May, there weren't any black fans, and there weren't any white fans. We were just Dodger fans." And maybe that's the real contribution of a Jackie Robinson. It was a small step in the direction of addressing and healing some of the racial issues that this country has had for so long of a time. All right, thank you very much. I hope you learned something or other here today. Thank you.